been announced that the Titan organization is going to close its doors and it's releasing all its players, including, for CSGO fans, obviously most relevantly, their long-standing CSGO French/Belgian division, which they've had since essentially the beginning of 2014. So we're talking about a 2-year span here. Now, first and foremost, this is sad for the organization on a CSGO front just because of where the team ended up by the end. Because the last lineup they had was overall the worst performing lineup they had. It had the least flair, it had the least of the natural identity that made Titan special in the past, was least able to compete on the world stage. It's also, in terms of the news, very frustrating for the Titan organization themselves, in as much as they never really got what they thought they were buying into. They kind of almost was sold a false bill of goods, but not knowingly through anyone's kind of understanding of the situation, just through a bunch of unfortunate circumstances, some happenstance, things that nobody could have predicted. And in the end, what they thought they were buying into, they never got. You have to understand that when Titan got this organization, they were literally buying, or rather recruiting, because VeryGames had to give up the team because the contracts had run out. They were literally recruiting the number one CSGO team in the world as the major era of CSGO, where we just had the first major, had just kicked off. And their team had been a favourite for that, and had been, in many ways, people thought like one of the best or the second best teams in that tournament, and had finished in the semi-finals. Yet, after 2 years of having this core lineup, they can only show off 2 trophies in terms of international competition. And that's very underwhelming. It's very disappointing when you consider what you had, because you thought you were recruiting a team that could potentially be a champion of a major. You thought you were recruiting a team that at the very least would be making deep runs into majors. Meanwhile, as Titan, they never made a single playoffs of a major. They qualified for them all, but they always fell out in the group stage. Yes, they had some other good performances. They did have a couple of trophies. They had some good top fours, had some good finals, had some good runs, had some very memorable matches. But unfortunately, that is still underwhelming when you consider what Titan thought that they were buying. So to understand the whole situation with Titan and how it played out, you have to understand the core that they got from VeryGames. Because the pedigree of VeryGames was the absolute cream of the crop in the games that they played in with this French core. So in Source, towards the last couple of years, they were the dominant team who won the majority of the lands and were the standard for excellence, had the best players, had the best in-game leader. Then you come into CSGO, and they were one of the elite teams for the first 4 or 5 months, where they were the clear-cut second best team, but unfortunately NIP was the best and also was a team who never lost. So they always beat VeryGames. But I feel like people always undervalue that VeryGames team. They don't realize the whole reason why that VeryGames always got to lose to NIP is they beat everyone else in the world. They had the tactics and they had the strategy to beat everyone else. They just didn't have as good players as the NIP team. They didn't have as good natural chemistry coming into the game with almost no practice like the NIP team amazingly did. But they were still a very good team. Then you go into the team that they had with Kenny S and Scream for sort of the first, I think it was the first sort of... let's think, how long was it? First, like 2 or 3 months, I think, of the year. This lineup they had was also a very good team, but it wasn't as elite as the team before, and they had the difficulties integrating Scream into the lineup, and other teams advanced in CSGO, but still a top 4, top 5 team. Then they got Shox into the lineup instead of Kenny S, and rapidly they became extremely good again, an elite level number 2 team in the world, winning tournaments, eventually overcoming NIP, their old nemesis who they'd never been able to defeat before. They overcame NIP, they managed to win 3 series in a row against them, win a couple of tournaments against them, win like 4 or 5 tournaments in the span, come into the major as the favourites, still make the semi-finals, still take NIP to 3 games. This was a great era, end the year, and you think, right, next year they're still the number 1 ranked team, maybe they can be the number 1 team again, maybe they can win the next major that comes up. Then they become Titan. Now, you have to understand, when this happened, there was lots of other options. Like, actually, if Fnatic's team hadn't won DreamHack Winter, they would have had a tough choice, because they could have obviously reinvested and gone, right, well, the whole Swedish-Danish thing didn't work in CSGO so far. Let's invest in this French team. They're the best team. Alliance supposedly were around, and they were looking for a team. This would have been a great pickup. Instead, Titan managed to secure the contracts. They bought into this team, and they invested in a heavy way, because at the time, no CSGO teams had team houses. And the Titan guys came in and they actually bought these guys a team house because they naively thought, when you looked at other esports games such as StarCraft and League of Legends, where resources mean you get a team house and that improves practice, they thought, if we're already the number one team, we've got this very tactical team, if we have a team house, we're going to be even better. Now, as we know, that ended up being a detrimental factor to the team, actually, not least because it upset the delicate balance, the dynamic of how Shox, this genius, fantastic, brilliant player, but one who has to be very comfortable and who has to have very certain circumstances and clearly wants to be around his girlfriend and his friends and not be all cooped up in a team house environment or only focusing on the game. He has to be someone who can express his passions and kind of vent in that aspect of life. So this was hindering to him. And even though the team in their first big tournament of the year, which was the DreamHack Stockholm Invitational, the 4-team Invitational with NIP, Fnatic, and Dignitas, even though they won this tournament, so they were the number one ranked team, after that, they would have a disastrous results because at the major, they famously didn't get out of the group stage. Then they lost at Copenhagen Games to domestic rivals LDLC, which was Happy's team, obviously. And Shox leaves the team. They get Kenny S back in. They've switched back around and like that again. They become an elite team again. They overcome that hurdle that they'd had before where they were dropping off and whatever problems happening. Even though they lost Shox, who at the time was considered the best player in the world, they come back to being an elite level team. They're still a contender for tournaments. They have a good showing against NIP at Star Series. They have a good showing against NIP at DreamHack Summer. Even though NIP is the number one team, they're taking them to 3 maps every time, having competitive series. They make it to the final of Gfinity G3, and they have a great series there, but they lose to the Virtus Pro. They unfortunately fail the major again with this lineup. Don't go out in the group stage. And then we have a shuffle. The LDLC guys. Here's what people don't know. LDLC ended up with the better team and ended up with all the success, but they don't realize the shuffle was initiated by Titan, by people like Existence, and by some of the LDLC players who were leaving LDLC, Apex, Maniac, to come to Titan. And the initial thing that people don't realize is Titan would have won the shuffle because the original move would have had it so that they'd have gotten Apex, they'd have gotten Maniac, they'd have had Kenny S, but they thought they were going to get to keep Existence, and here's the key part, they thought they were going to get to keep NBK, who's obviously, we now know, one of the linchpin pieces to the great French teams of all time because he's so versatile, because he builds in the system to the in-game leader. So he was a very vital number 2 guy to Existence's system. But the fact that they were going to cut Smiths, the fact they were going to do this move in this way, made NBK decide, I don't want to be a part of this. And he left as well and went to the team that eventually became LDLC. So that was the big upset there. If they'd have kept NBK, when you consider having Kenny S in God mode and all that, they might have been the best French team. They might have been one of the great teams of the world. But that move changed history, and they couldn't have foreseen that, obviously. But they still end up with a good team. The difference is they had a very good, like, Na'Vi-esque upset style team who could match up very well against certain teams, famously Fnatic, famously Envious, LDLC at the time, and they could, on the right day, when Kenny S is going off, Kaylee's going off, they could win matches, and we saw this because they won their first big tournament when they went and won DreamHack Stockholm Invitational, beating Fnatic, who was the same lineup, who went on to be the greatest team of all time, beat LDLC, who went on to be the second great team of the era, and they won the tournament with these 4-0 in maps. Very impressive stuff. But they still showed signs elsewhere. ESWC France, they beat Envious. That actually prompted Envious, it was LDLC at the time, to make the change of Happy becoming the in-game leader, which really helped that team actually. But then obviously they lost to the same team in the round of 8 of ESWC France. Then unfortunately disaster struck because then Kaylee got banned. Again, think how unlucky this organisation is. They couldn't have known this guy was cheating. They couldn't have known what circumstances he cheated in. In fact, no one to this day still knows. But he was VAC banned, and as a result, because it was so close to the major, they had their spot taken away from them in the major, and they were outright. Well, I think they would. Let me think. I think they'd qualified already. I think they had their spot taken away in the major, and not only that, they were told, the other 4 members, you can't even try and re-qualify. You can't even go for these extra last chance spot in this scenario, even though they would have had one of the easy groups if you ever saw what the lineup was like there. So yeah, very sad circumstances. And then all the top talent was taken by LDLC Envious. So where are you supposed to get your next player? I mean, your LDLC White, those players, as they would next be known next year, we still didn't even barely know those guys. Those were no-namers. Those weren't people who had any tenure. So there was nearly no one to pick up. And so they were having to go to ESCA with their manager, a guy who used to play over a year prior and years prior to that in CS 1.6. They were having to take him along with them. And Kenny S was in God mode here. He went absolutely crazy. And he was so good. He did carry the org for a long time. But that lack of the legit player, the second star or another a top player that they could have in terms of pure firepower, that cost them their titles. If the Kaylee lineup had stayed together, if Kaylee hadn't got banned, I'm actually quite sure, I think it's quite a reasonable thing to suggest that they would have been like a Na'Vi. They would never have been the number one team. They'd probably never really even have been a top 4 team, which Na'Vi did eventually become. But I think they would have been capable. I'm talking about the Na'Vi prior to getting Flamey, by the way. But they would have been a team that would have won the odd title. They would have had the one day where everything went great, or they would have made more finals, or they would have made more top 4s. Instead, they got RPK, who just became a consistent player, and they did manage to become a solid team. People underrate how good they were. For the first 6 months, they were making top 4s. They had the odd final. They had upset wins. They beat Fnatic in best of 3 series, something Envious couldn't do at the time. They managed to get these wins over big teams and show impressive maps and impressive series, impressive deep runs in tournaments. Kenny S obviously was the best player in the world at one point in time. They obviously, though, did not succeed at the majors again, unfortunately. So then the second shuffle came. And in the second shuffle, now they lost Kenny S, now they lost Apex, and they got Shox, okay, one of the great players of all time, but they had to get Smiths back. And so unfortunately, this time the shuffle wasn't initiated by them, but they got the worst end of it again. And so then they got Scream back into the lineup. They go to the major. They actually were in position to beat old rivals NIP, to get out of the group, to make the round of 8 for the first time under the Titan org. Disaster strikes. They get wrecked by NIP in really shocking fashion when they were so close to already having one map 1 and having a strong map 2 coming up. And they get wrecked 2-0 and really embarrassing fashion where they won only something like 2 out of 24 of their last rounds. Ultra wrecked on Dust 2. They go out of the tournament. Very disappointing stuff. Another failed opportunity to make the playoffs. Then they go to CEVO. And at CEVO, actually, they had a last hurrah. They managed to beat Luminosity in a series. They managed to get to the top 4. But even though there were good teams in this tournament, they managed to beat Na'Vi. Overall, it's still not that great a result. Still wasn't showing signs that they were going to become a great team. And obviously now the team's at an end. Now the lineup itself may continue on. And in fact, I'm almost certain they will get an org. Like, I can't reveal any behind the scenes details, but I know there were orgs reaching out to them and that there were orgs that have good offers. And here's the key thing you have to understand as a fan, if you don't understand the current landscape of CSGO. Because of the tenure E-League, the fact there's going to be so many spots for lesser teams, and the fact that so many NA orgs, especially from League of Legends, Dota 2, want to get into CSGO, the buyouts for all the currently signed players in the world mean that you can't just get those guys and pay them a good salary, give them that, and all the expenses and all the rest of it. You also have to pay like, $40,000 or $50,000 a player, or you have to make a team from players who aren't around. So if you have a whole lineup like Titan, who's a top 10 team in the world, and they don't have any buyouts, that's incredibly cheap for you to invest. And it's going to be a better lineup than most of those like second string or third string NA teams that you would have had to get otherwise. So there will be a bidding war, and these guys will get a good org, and ideally the core will stay together, even if they aren't that great at the moment. But then again, if Envious keeps struggling, eventually they're going to kick someone out, and then Titan will undoubtedly get a good player no matter who it is. So it's sad, unfortunately, as I mentioned, that Titan, in all good faith, did buy what they thought was the best team in the world, and they never really had the best team in the world beyond the first few months of their tenure with this lineup. For the rest of the time, they had an elite team for like another year, and then they had a team that was competitive, and then at the very end, they had a team that was just clinging on to the top 10. And during periods of time, they had the best player in the world. They had Shox, they had Kenny S, they had the best in-game leader at certain points in time existence. They had some fantastic benefits, but a mixture of luck, a mixture of the tragedy of certain people's storylines, Kenny S being God mode, but when they could never win tournaments, existence being incredibly tactically sound, but not always having the firepower and the tools to win with, Kaylee getting banned. A lot of these things, the fact that they seem to choke in the majors for some reason, a lot of these factors meant they never got the success that as an org, you've done your part on the business end, you've made the shrewd decisions, and you kind of, the way that it turned out in the game, where only the players can decide the match, unfortunately didn't live up to what you should have gotten. And so I feel sorry for the Titan organization, even though it was a beautiful ride to watch. It was something special to be a part of. It was interesting to see the way it evolved. The storyline was always vital, very vibrant, very interesting, very captivating, compelling. So it was a wonderful thing to watch, even if it never really ascended to the heights it could have, as we saw in the late 2013 with the VeryGames lineup there, where they were the best team in the world and one of the best teams of all time. Now then, if you play at Alpha Draft, you could scream when you win sick money. The kind which helped Titan, or could have helped Titan, remain afloat in CSGO. If you rack up kills like a natural born killer, or just chill with your friends, just be regular John Smiths. If you find the inside edge to be really good at picking players in fantasy esports, you won't get banned like Kaylee. And they welcome masterminds like Existence, who can kind of see the way the game's going to go, know what moves to make, the correct picks, the correct decisions. That's how you win Skrilla. Now, there's thrills, there's skrills, there's spills, there's shocks that all await you at Alpha Draft. Can you believe it?